Caller, you're on mute.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's only been 2 years, but we still forget to unmute sometimes, My apologies for that. My name is Carla Morales. I am the Vice President of the Arizona Technology Council. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we're happy to have you. For those of you that may not know, the Tech Council is a premier statewide trade association focused on technology-based companies. We provide about 150 to 160 events throughout the year, and focusing a great deal on our virtual events to make sure that we approach and connect with everybody statewide. We are also the voice and the face for our members in legislature. We do a lot of great things for our members and communicate with them through our number of publications. And we negotiate lower cost products and services and offer health insurance and 401k plans. We welcome you today to today's virtual TED Talk series. The conversation for today is on supply chain, how disruption can help us drive new ideas. Some housekeeping for today. Please be sure to keep your cameras off and your microphones muted. We want to make sure that the focus today is on our amazing panel that we have joining us today and our moderator. We ask that you please keep all of your questions in the chat, and the moderator will compile the questions and pick from there at the end of the session during our QA session. Just for you all to know, there are currently sponsorships available for future series events. Please make sure to visit our website at www.aztechcouncil.org or reach out to Jamie or myself for more information. I'll be sure to put that information in the chat as well. If you're interested in becoming a member or becoming a sponsor, please make sure you reach out to us. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to please introduce you to all Jan Knight from Bancroft Information Services, Business and Market Research, as she's providing the insight to entrepreneurs with research-driven writing. Jan, thank you so much for moderating today's event. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will be totally honest and explain that we've had a couple of technical issues. So one of the things I'm going to do today is be looking away from my screen, and I apologize for that. I had better plans. I want to introduce our three great panelists. First of all, Ken Geyer is a 1999 graduate of the weekend MBA program at the U of A, University of Arizona, and has over 30 years of experience in project management, operations, and supply chain across several industries. His most recent being 18 years with Raytheon, one of our largest employers here in town. There he had full financial responsibility for multiple programs and led several operations and supply chain organizations. He has been an adjunct lecturer at the University of Arizona in MIS since 2006, teaching project management, operations, and supply chain across several different platforms. He's now a full-time lecturer at U of A and will be leading their review and refocus of the operations and supply chain management major within the MIS department. Next, we have Kathy Leonard, who I'm honored to say I have actually done some market research for. She is from the state of Maine, as is actually Harry, which is a total coincidence. I had no idea when I invited Harry. So we've got two Mainers and an Arizonan here. Kathy is the CEO and owner of Auburn Manufacturing. For over 4 decades, the company has been producing extreme heat and fire-resistant textile products for industrial, defense-related, and institutional applications. Major industries her company serves include shipbuilding and repair, petroleum, petrochemical, power generation, foundry and metal fabrication, aerospace, automotive, and institutional facilities. So busy company. During the last decade, and this is kind of cool, the company was successful in its anti-dumping countervailing duty petition against Chinese imports. If you can tell us more about that, if anybody has a question. Duties up to 300% were imposed on Chinese silica fabrics entering the US in 2017 in response to that effort. And we have Harry, who actually I found online once I was doing a research project for a machine shop, looking at how they were planning to reshore. So Harry is the founder of the Reshoring Initiative. And before starting this, he served as president of GF Machining Solutions for 22 years. His awards include Industry Week's Manufacturing Hall of Fame. And he's participated in President Obama's January 2012 Insourcing Forum and is a member of the US Department of Commerce Investment Advisory Council. Harry holds a BS and MS degree in engineering from MIT and an MBA.
Looks like we lost Jan.
Yeah, it looks like we lost her. And she mentioned she was having technical difficulties earlier. We will let her catch up with us. She was in the middle of, I think she was just finishing up on her introductions. We
She's
can go
done,
ahead
yeah.
and begin the conversation. Harry, do you want to go ahead and begin the conversation? I believe you had the questions and she sent over to you, correct?
Yeah, I can do that. The first question was about disruptions. You know, what's happening? What does that suggest about the supply chain? And if somebody could pull up my first slide, that would give some representation of disruptions and what's happened in the last 10, 12 years. There we go. We've seen a series of disruptions that companies are starting to understand. They're integrating together. So we've had the Fukushima tsunami, obviously a huge disaster in Japan. We've had the COVID crisis coming out of China. We had floods in Thailand that caused all kinds of products that were necessary around the world not to be available. There was a volcano in Iceland that stopped air freight from Europe. And then the Suez Canal crisis that was a disaster for weeks. And we had our own LA dock strike. So companies look at all this and they say, wow, the disruptions happen. They don't happen a 100-year thing, but every year something's happening, something that can significantly disrupt or destroy my supply chain. And so companies are starting to recognize that getting rid of eliminating all of those potentials for disruption in the other country, getting across the ocean, getting in through the port, by eliminating those, they can smooth things out and in some cases justify a higher FOB price from the US because our wages are higher. We saw that in the cases of reshoring, so we track reshoring, and in the cases of reshoring, starting in about March of 2020, about 60% of the cases mentioned COVID as one of the causes for their reshoring. So companies are doing it either in the medical industry or they're seeing what happened in medical. There's also possible future disruptions. I have a friend who's a sinologist, a top China expert, and he talks about decoupling. He thinks that he's sure, I'm not sure, but he's sure that China will voluntarily decouple, that they will be so mad at the US because of Taiwan, because of Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, because of Trump tariffs and so on, that they will not allow their companies to ship us anything. And that'll be devastating for both countries. And is it significantly probable? I hope not. But is it something that should at least be on the list for companies to think about? I'd say yes.
Great, thank you for sharing that. I see that Jan is actually just joining us. I'll give her a second. If not, we'll move on over with Ken.
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest differences now, we've seen, limited, supply chain disruptions around a lot of what Harry just mentioned. Even in the defense and aerospace industry, there are specialized metals, things like that, unfortunately, in some cases, have to come, from a global environment. And so we've seen things here and there that have popped up, and usually there's a little bit of disruption and you're able to overcome. This time, the significance is much different. Especially if you look at it from the perspective of the aerospace industry. There's been a lot of impact to the slowdown in air travel, cancellation of new planes, service contracts. If I look at it from Raytheon's perspective, they have the defense or the commercial side of the house now that's really been impacted quite a bit by the commercial slowdown. Where on the other hand, if you look at it from the defense industry perspective, one of the I'll say the luxuries that the defense industry has is just the fact that they can claim priority status. Different government contracts have what they call ACAT ratings, and those allow priority for those contracts when it comes to a supply chain perspective. But I think even with those, there are still some areas that you even if you have that rating, you're still not going to be able to get something if it's not available. And so I think, I think it's having every industry, whether it be commercial, defense, it doesn't really matter. Everybody is rethinking exactly how they're going to handle their supply chain in the future.
Thanks for sharing, Ken. Jan, have you joined us back yet?
I'm actually joining you on the phone.
Great. I'll let you go ahead and take over then.
That's fine. So did you actually hear all of the introductions? Did we get through that?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, great.
Yes, and we went ahead and began with the first question, and Harry and Ken have just finished up their comments on that.
Thank you very much. Let me just jump in here and explain one of the things that we were going to talk about as far as a quick introduction. When we first discovered that there were supply chain issues due to COVID last year, we decided on this topic. But then since then, we've had a lot of other things happening, certainly. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of those before we move on. So in addition to COVID, of course, we saw that large container ship, the Ever Given, stuck in the Suez Canal for 6 days in March earlier. Did you know that even has its own Wikipedia entry now called the 2021 Suez Canal Obstruction? We've had deep freezes in Texas causing a plastic shortage from chemical plant shutdowns. We've all seen news of the ports, the containers sitting off of LA and San Francisco, and of course the semiconductor shortages. I was going to call this panel a subtitle of From Semiconductors to Plastic Giraffes. What that's about is during COVID, board games really started to get popular again. And unfortunately, a lot of those plastic pieces for board games, like plastic giraffes and animals, do come from China. So that was an introduction that I'm jumping in to give here to give a feel for how wide this issue is, how broad the issue is, and it's not just COVID. And also everybody probably has noticed that every industry analyst or association is either documenting this problem or is having webinars to discuss how to solve this problem. So I will go back to our outline, and we wanted next to talk a little bit about the reshoring specifically, and this is where Harry
You missed
the
Kathy.
Jan, I know you can't see me, so I should stop waving. But I didn't get a chance to give my input on question 1, so.
I apologize. Thank you.
That's all right. That's
Go ahead,
all right.
Kathy.
And it was great to hear from both Harry and Ken. And let me just give my perspective as a manufacturer. So as Jan introduced me, I've been in business for over 40 years. And so starting the business in 1979, the biggest problem we had was inflation and the interest rates that went along with trying to abate that. That seems so minor now when you consider all these other upheavals in the world since then. But we lived in sort of a dream world back then. In the 80s, we were an up and coming company that we're using all domestically made materials because we use fiberglass and other synthetic fibers that were developed in the US. A lot of it they were developed for the space program. And so life was good. Our materials were right nearby. We had excellent technical help from the manufacturers, and these are Fortune 500 companies that would help us learn the markets and develop markets and so forth. It was a very, very exciting time. And we were just darlings of industrial materials. But then in the early 2000s, things began to change as the US changed its trade policy to a more, free trade, free for all, I would call it, so that we slowly lost a lot of our customers who were OEMs who eventually went offshore. We transferred a lot of technology, and we lost our suppliers to a large extent. So, and I guess, I think the number is 5 million jobs were lost in the United States since then. But lucky for us as Auburn Manufacturing, we were able to stay domestic, much to Ken's experience at Raytheon. I mean, because we're part of the defense industrial base, we sell our products to the defense industry. We are required by contract to supply either over 50% domestic content in our product or up to 100% if the Berry Amendment is applied. And that is applied in many of the contracts that we service because we're a textile manufacturer. So we've been able to get through that until, China, until American companies actually went offshore to China, transferred technology. And in the commercial markets, we've seen a lot of these technical products come back since the 2000s, come back to the US and selling them through supply chains that are primarily just distributors of foreign made products. And that damaged the industrial base even more. So we, as Jan said, we were somewhat successful in filing an anti-dumping case, but that doesn't stop there. There's a lot of aftermath that goes along with that, and the battle continues, believe me. But COVID really did change the playing field, as far as I'm concerned. All those other traumas are there as well, but COVID changed because it gave us this wonderful example of PPE. Watching people wear trash bags, healthcare workers wearing trash bags to protect themselves was an eye-opener. It was just horrific to see that happening. And all because we had sold our souls and had our supply chains all over the world, and we weren't able to make PPE here in the United States, or at least not as quickly as we could. Being part of the textile industry, we're not into making that type of PPE, but we belong to an organization, the National Council of Textile Organizations, does support that effort. And there's been a miraculous change. A lot of these companies have been able to turn and to pivot to make PPE within weeks. It's been amazing what the American companies can do. So that's where we are now. As far as my company goes, we were able to survive so far through COVID. For the last 18 months, we've still stayed with our suppliers, and we're still here. And it's good to see that finally we're waking up as a country and thinking about, that it's important to our security to pay attention to domestic supply chains.
Great, yeah. Thank you. I'm back. Yes, so that was a great addition. Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah.
So now we will turn to Harry. I'd like to discuss the topic and the benefits of reshoring a little bit more in depth. So I mentioned reshoring to somebody the other day, and they said, is that nearshoring? Is that different? So, the good definition would be great from you, Harry. What's the mission also, in addition, what is the mission of your initiative? Why is it important? And I know your website, which I think you've put into chat, offers some of the some tools and such for people researching options on reshoring. So go ahead and tell us, this is your opportunity to tell us all about reshoring.
Thank you, Jan. First, definitions. We look at reshoring and also FDI. So FDI would be like Taiwan Semiconductor building a factory in Arizona, for example. That's foreign direct investment. But whereas reshoring would be Intel deciding to produce here once again what they had previously been producing offshore. That's reshoring. In both cases, the companies have concluded that they will be more successful if they supply the market by producing in the market instead of shipping from somewhere else to the market. So reshoring and FDI, very, very similar trends. Our mission, I think Kathy mentioned the 5 million manufacturing jobs. That's the number that the U.S. will pick up at current levels of productivity when we have balanced the trade deficit, the $1 trillion trade deficit. So our mission is to bring those 5 million jobs back. We're making pretty good progress in bringing jobs back. We get slide 2 pulled up there. And in reality, when we started in 2010, about 6,000 jobs were announced coming back. You can see in 2010 the sum of the reshoring and FDI. In 2017,
Harry, excuse me, I don't think it's sharing. There we go.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Thank you. I couldn't.
Yep.
Thank you.
In 2017, it peaked at about 180,000. Again, the sum of the two. It fell due to the tax and regulatory cuts. Fell off in 2018 and 19 because of the trade war, business uncertainty. Companies didn't know what to do. didn't know how long the tariffs were going to last on whom. It was just chaotic. And then 2020, reshoring picked up. Companies significantly brought back PPE, like Kathy was mentioning, probably 100,000 jobs or 50,000 jobs just with PPE. And now in 2021, both trends, both the reshoring and FDI, look like they're going to hit a new level of 200 to 220,000 jobs announced, significantly driven by chips and EV batteries and rare earth minerals, all this stuff that we became too dependent on, and the country is now funding to bring back. So why is this important? Companies do most of the R&D. Manufacturing companies do. So if you don't do manufacturing, eventually you don't do R&D. It's important to have manufacturing near engineering. In general, if you have engineering in, say, Arizona and you have manufacturing in China, very hard for them to optimize the product and the process because they're not talking in the same time zone, in the same language physically together. The multiplier effect is highest for manufacturing versus any other kind of work. Budget deficits. We obviously have like $1 trillion budget deficits, look like they're going to go on forever. Significant reduction if we had those 5 million people paying taxes and their companies making more profits and paying taxes. Defense preparedness, Raytheon. The Defense Department periodically comes out with reports on all the products it cannot get in the US and it can't even get from our allies that it has to buy from our potential adversaries. So I think maybe equally important is what I call national confidence. The US has felt like a malaise, like a sort of a gradual, continuous decline, and seeing China especially growing so rapidly. And I think that's hurt our national image and confidence. And seeing the US come back in that area will be very good for morale in the country.
Yeah, I think to kind of tack on to what Harry just mentioned, I think the U.S. government does absolutely look at ways that they can bring more things back home. Earlier Kathy mentioned the Berry Amendment, which we call the Buy America Act, and that's a very important component from a defense perspective. An interesting thing though is I had read something the other day about they had the government had gone through and looked at how they can bring more of those suppliers, here to the States. And it's a little counterintuitive if you look at the really, I'll say the actions of the DoD in that, defense spending is so unpredictable. We're always on the verge of cutting defense spending. And so what that's doing is that's forcing the defense companies to look internationally for business. And usually what comes along with that is offsets, requirements and things like that with some countries, which means inherently you have to put suppliers in a foreign country. And so now you get into that catch-22 where you're trying to bring things home, but you're also forced in some cases to push things international. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves, throughout the remainder of the pandemic and all the supply chain issues that we're having, and how the government behavior does or doesn't change.
Yeah, and Kathy, you and I had talked a little bit about that. You had said your experience was kind of relatively calm because you had mostly U.S. supplies. You may have touched on this earlier when I wasn't here. Can you talk a little bit about that, about why maybe it's not been such an issue for you?
Yeah, since the pandemic started, and we had no disruption in our supply chains because they were U.S. and there was enough. Being a manufacturer, you have to plan ahead for materials. So our raw materials were coming in at a regular pace. First quarter 20 was an unbelievable quarter for us. We had done a real resurgence in business, and then COVID hit, so everybody held up their orders. However, being deemed essential by the Department of Defense, we maintained our workforce and stayed making materials for stock and stayed on that throughout the second quarter into third quarter, and were able to begin serving customers again in the fourth quarter of 2020. So it was pretty good. We made it through that. We thought 2021 was going to be wonderful. And as somebody just said, I think Ken said, we get priority from our domestic suppliers, so that those who had gone offshore for raw materials are kind of at the end of the line, and we're in the front of the line, because we had stayed with our suppliers. Our vendors are precious to us, and we have very good relationships with them, and they've responded in that regard. So until recently, it's just in the past 6 months, we're starting to see that catch up with all of our supply chains, because the demand has picked up, and a lot of manufacturers are caught flat-footed. They just didn't have the resources.
Yeah.
Some had laid off people because they didn't have enough business, and now they've got to jump back on. So we're all trying to play catch up right now, and it has played out by rising prices and slower deliveries. So inflation is an issue, and whether it's transitory or not, we're not sure. The Fed isn't saying, but it's kind of a scary time from that.
Yeah, and it's the unknown, and I mentioned to a couple of you before we came on that I had attended a webinar yesterday for the Global Chamber. We had a lot of people from Mexico, and one of the things they were talking about is how some companies in the US have now moved some of their manufacturing from, say, China, Asia to Mexico. So at least it may not be the US, but it's a little shorter trip, right? And we also, somebody gave some data that was, let's say a ship, a half container coming from Italy or China used to cost maybe $2,200, $2,400. Now it's running around anywhere between $15,000 and $50,000, which, as you pointed out, pricing. What does that do to somebody's pricing? So, yeah.
Another advantage of the nearshoring, although my first priority is to get work back to the U.S., but if there's something that's so labor intense that it's either China or Mexico, if it's Mexico, because their wage rates are lower even than China's, the product coming out of Mexico has about 40% U.S. content, whereas the product coming out of China has 5% U.S. content. So getting it back to Mexico is sort of like getting half a loaf, and I'd rather have half than none.
Right. I'll just throw in too that two of our biggest export markets are Mexico and Canada. Those because of the nearshoring that takes place, American specifications go along with that, with those moves. And so the same materials that are used in automotive here would be used in automotive there, and mining and so forth. So, we consider Mexico and Canada truly our neighbors and best friends.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a good point. The next topic we talked about was thinking of some of the segments we have here in Tucson. We've talked about, we've got obviously travel and food service, but we've got some clusters in aerospace and defense, mining, optics, things like that. There are some people probably in the audience representing those industries. So I'd like to talk about, if any of you have input, I was going to start with Ken on if you have any input on specific industries. Again, you may have discussed it a little bit just now because you said it doesn't really matter what industry you're in, you're being affected, but talk to us a little bit about how some of the local industries are affected.
Well, I think what we've seen is, it's a very dichotomous situation with demand. Some industries have suffered from a lack of demand, where others have really almost, and I hate to use the word suffered, but suffered from an unexpected rise in demand. And I just did a KOLD news segment a couple of weeks ago on the impact of supply chain disruptions on school lunches. And they're struggling to figure out what they're going to feed kids on a week-to-week basis because they have no idea what they're going to get or when they're going to get it. And luckily, they have some inventory where they're able to keep some things around. But that's a case where the food service industry has really been impacted because demand has gone up, and with labor shortages and things like that, it's disrupted the supply chains from that perspective. But then you look at airlines, car rental companies, the whole hospitality industry. They've got a lot of inventory, and their inventory is fixed, and so that they have a lack of demand to fill it. Now that's changing somewhat, but still, if you look at the airline industry, I just read an article this morning on Southwest Airlines. They've got a lot of capacity, but the problem is everything is so tight that any disruption, you've seen Southwest and American both. Any slight disruption, messes up the entire system. because they are so tight on labor. They're tight on, they're trying to fill planes as much as they can, but that means there's no margin for error. And so juggling that the inventory from both of those perspectives has been very difficult, not knowing whether they have enough or having too much and not being able to keep up with the lack of demand.
Harry, what are your thoughts? I know you've worked with some companies in Arizona.
Yeah, the interesting trend in Arizona back for the years 2010 through 2020, Arizona was average number 15 in the states in terms of the amount of reshoring and FDI, but in 2021 they're number 2. So Arizona's looking pretty good, and that was driven significantly by the announcements of the Intel and Taiwan Semi, and also some related suppliers like Linde announced putting in a facility to provide gas to the chip foundries. So it's not just the foundries; it's everything that goes around it that makes them possible. So for an example, slide number 3, if we could pull up. There's an example of a Tucson company called GW Plastics, a contract manufacturer that has done a good job helping its customers reshore. Customer says, I want to produce things here. I want to get my components here once again. And GW Plastics has succeeded in doing that. In fact, we see companies like contract manufacturers and smaller OEMs advertising and promoting on their website that they're available to help companies reshore, and here's what the advantages are for bringing it back. So we encourage people to think about that. Could we get slide number 4? And that's about how to make that decision. So we're sure that maybe 60% of companies look only at the ex-works price or the FOB price, and rather than looking at all the relevant costs and risks. So I took the first 180 cases where users had come on and used our free online TCO estimator to help them make that decision. And the blue line shows the Chinese price as a percentage of the US price. At 100%, they're equal. To the left, China's lower. To the right, US is lower. So you can see that in terms of price, China averages maybe 70% of our price, which is why people go there and buy stuff, because it is so much cheaper. But when they look at total cost, which is the price plus duty, freight, packaging, carrying cost of inventory, the risk of stocking out and what that does to your sales, you get the red line. And if there happens to also be a 15% Trump tariff, then you get the yellow line. Same cases, just changing the assumptions. And you can see the key impact is on the right, to the right of the 100% vertical line. On price, the US wins 8% of the time. On total cost, 32% of the time. And if there's a Trump tariff, then 46% of the time. So just by doing the math correctly, just by the companies recognizing all the costs and risks, we can bring back 20, 30% of what's now offshore. So I offer this to the listeners to say it's worth doing the evaluation, use our free system for doing it, see what makes sense to come back. I'm not telling you to bring back everything. I'm suggesting in your own interest and the country's and Arizona's interest, do the math and see what makes sense to bring back.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great job. So Kathy, you have specific issues because you do work on government defense projects and industrial manufacturing. And can you tell us a little bit about the specifics of what's different with industrial manufacturing?
Industrial manufacturing, customers aren't as generally as litty as the retail markets. If and a lot of our products have to meet specific requirements in terms of the technical capabilities of the products, especially when you're talking about high temperature materials. You've got to be clear on the insulation qualities of these products and the flammability and that sort of thing. And you've got to have the pedigree of the product built into the product so that you can that it is what you say it is, and it's made with the materials that you say it's made. You have to do a lot of certifications. And so it is more technical, and it's important that you support those supply chains. So, and our customers are they're big companies that require certifications on these products. We have third-party certifications done on a lot of our products so that the markets can feel more secure using those. But that all comes at a cost, and I just listening to Harry's, I like that grid that shows, what the real cost is of the China product, because we've done all this work in the US and then China figures out how to do it and copies it. It may or may not be the same product that it looks to be in the marketplace. And of course, we get no subsidies from our government. And that is the biggest problem with the Chinese imports, is that they are heavily subsidized. And ours have never been heavily subsidized. So it's interesting now to see that chart that you're showing there. It makes so much sense. And for me, it's like, of course, we understand that.
Well, Kathy, I hope you'll use it when you're selling.
When we're selling, yes, I should use it when I've tried everything else, but for the longest time, for the last 2 decades, it's been all about price, which I'm sure Ken can talk about, because that is what our purchasing silos are, intended to do, is to buy the cheapest product and to buy it just in time. So, we all got spoiled by having product at our beck and call at all times and just have it delivered the next day. It was just magic. But making things takes time. So that's, there's a lot of investment that takes place in a manufacturing outfit.
Well, and actually, that leads us into making things needs people, right? Yeah. And one of the things we wanted to touch on was workforce issues. So shortages of product can't always be blamed on supplies if there's a delivery of products. So these disruptions that I announced in my introduction, right? It can be bad weather. It can be all the bad storms, truck drivers, lack of truck drivers, no people to unload container ships, but people with the right skills. So of course, this does touch on things like immigration. It also policies. It also touches on education policy. So actually, Kathy, let's just stay with you. You had said, I think, some things are happening in the state of Maine. I'm not sure where else they're happening, but just briefly, if you can just briefly tell us a little bit about that.
I'd be glad to, because I'm on the board of the Maine Community College System. So I got to hear this information firsthand. It's so exciting that some of the federal funding that came from COVID is being funneled into the community college system, along with private investment to the tune of about $60 million. So probably a state the size of Arizona, that wouldn't be that much money, but in the state of Maine with 1.3 million people, that's a lot of money. And we are putting it to good use here. The Maine Community College System is prepared to help businesses develop their workforces or redevelop their workforces, or to train their workforces, or to train people to become part of our workforce. And we're starting the process ourselves as a company, and I'm so excited about it, because what they're doing is allowing us, like for instance, we have work instructions, work procedures built into our ISO system, but they're all a narrative. They're written. There's books that have all that text in them, but we're going to bring this alive, more of a day in the life of a worker in a textile factory. How do we make things? And using a lot of video and being able to put all of that into a training module that will be housed and actually held by the community college system, that we can access and add to, and it's ours. But this is going to change everything. I believe that it's just a new way of training people, and we hope to get more young people excited about manufacturing, as excited as we are. It takes a certain type of person that likes to make things, but there's a lot of us out there that like to make things. So
right, and there's a lot of honorable work in the trades and manufacturing. And I know that I'm not sure if she's on today, but we have a couple of Tech Council members who are involved in workforce. So hopefully they will be able to talk about that locally. And Ken, just you have some input, I know, on the defense industry and such. And workforce.
I do. Before I go into that, though, I actually wanted to tag on to what Kathy just mentioned about students and their interest in
Yeah.
manufacturing. We've actually seen an increase in next year's applications for the operations and supply chain management major within the MIS department in Eller. So I think, you know, the visibility of the supply chain issues has really created a lot of interest, because I mean, students are smart. They know where, you know, they know where the jobs are going, and so they're very interested in that. So I thought that was a very interesting trend to see that change.
Yeah, good trend.
But if you look at, you know, from a labor shortage perspective, you know, from the defense industry, I think one of the biggest issues that we had throughout this entire thing was more, you know, because, you know, Raytheon was an essential business, and so, you know, they worked through the entire thing. We never stopped. But you know, one of the things that we struggled a lot with was either, you know, people being afraid to come to work. You know, especially early in the pandemic, you had a lot of cases where somebody would come to work and turn out, you know, to be COVID positive, which would shut down a part of the factory so they could do, you know, the cleaning. And then we had, you know, quarantining going on. I think you're seeing a little bit less of that now, but I think now what you're seeing a little bit is some of the consternation between workers on vaccination versus non-vaccination, and people not wanting to be around other people. And it's really, to me, it's almost been it's been a roller coaster of people, you know, the workforce from a labor perspective. I know within the university, we've had actually had very good luck. You know, the students have actually been very compliant on the masking, in non-social distancing, you know, in those situations. And so we've actually, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was a very, very low percentage of what they're tracking internally at the university level, even having full classes. You know, one of my classes has 50 students in it. And so there's no possible way to social distance, but they've been able to, you know, everybody's good about masking, and I haven't had any issues, you know, knock on wood. So I think it's kind of been a roller coaster from a labor perspective. And I know a lot of the, you know, you look at the restaurant industry and in the hospitality industry, and just, you know, being able to get people, you know, to come to work and want to work, and it's just been it's been a roller coaster for sure.
And then it's not just about pricing and such that is related to that, but it's customer service, right? A lot of us are finding that restaurants, if we are eating outdoors here, that they're lacking service. I mean, it's as basic as that. It's not so much a supply chain, although they're lacking food, right? The signs at Starbucks saying they're out of certain food. So
yeah.
Harry, because we're running a little short on time, happy to, you know, have you comment on the skilled workforce just briefly.
Just quickly, from a longer term perspective, manufacturing has always been, for 20 or 30 years, has been very difficult to get the workforce. So students coming out of high school looked at what industry, what kind of job should I go in, and manufacturing didn't look so good because so much of the work was going offshore. Why should I get trained for something where there's not going to be a job? And so the industry perception hurt, and at the same time, there's a continued tension, I'd say, and misinformation about university degrees versus training. You look at the government data, and it says income goes up with number of degrees, $1 million more lifetime income if you get a university degree instead of a high school degree, but they fail to show that there's also an apprenticeship, that there's skills in a trade, or I call it a profession, and that actually the people with those skills make as much or more than the average of the bachelor's degree holders. But the government hasn't gotten that information out, therefore the guidance counselor or the student hasn't seen it. So for us, the solution is an apprenticeship system like Germany or Switzerland's. If we had that, we wouldn't have a trade deficit. Everything would be great. There is a good trend in the U.S. towards apprenticeships, credentials, community college training, technical training. Other countries at the same time are having problems. I read an article from a Chinese factory owner saying, I can't get any workers. They all want to go to university and go into paperwork jobs, kind of thing. And so we're getting better. The rest of them are getting worse. We're going to be okay.
Yeah, I like that. I come from the UK, and we had a strong apprenticeship, City of Guilds apprenticeship program for trades, and I think they still do. It's worthy. We do want still to allow 10 minutes for questions, or 5 or 10 minutes. So our last topic, given that we are the Arizona Technology Council, is to talk a little bit about technologies. I've attended a couple of webinars from supply chain management technology companies, but just to kind of cut to the chase, let's start with Ken. What do you think, what role does technology have in helping or at least solving on the short term any of these issues?
So I think, we've been down a journey for a little while here with Industry 4.0, which is actually, had its roots prior to the COVID pandemic, but it's really around digital transformation, and it's around, how do you digitally link the supply chain, but even bigger than that, it's supply chain analytics. And I mean, we've got a lot of data now. We have a year and a half worth of data on how supply chains behaved throughout this pandemic. We have a lot of great tools that we can use going forward to start analyzing that data and say, start doing the what ifs. And I think companies are going to start to use that data to really start to look at, what technologies can we put in place? How would we be better prepared in the future if something like this happens? So, big data really and Industry 4.0 is really where I see a real acceleration.
So from a practical point of view, Kathy, just briefly, have you had any experience in incorporating technologies, changing technologies to help?
Well, somewhat. Using this new technology, new platform, this virtual teaching platform is going to allow us to, to put our training materials, at least make them digital. So that's one thing we can do. And but we're a little behind the curve. We haven't had the funds to just go ahead and get a full-fledged ERP system installed here. We're behind the curve. We've got to catch up. Small companies like us kind of got left by the wayside, and we've got to catch up. But now that we're thinking about how to train people, we're also thinking of using technology for our preventive maintenance programs, because we've got a lot of equipment that has to be maintained, and using augmented reality, AR is a way to do maintenance on equipment, and we might not have to do the spreadsheets if we just use those types of programs. So trying to apply it to a small business, a small manufacturing business, sort of downsizing the technology that big businesses have been using for decades.
Yeah,
that would be great, and if it's affordable for guys.
You're a little bit at a disadvantage, but maybe that's where there's some opportunities for innovation, right? For some of these tech companies to innovate for the small business.
Smaller business, downsize the products.
Thank you. And Harry, I know, go ahead. I know you have some input on, what people should or should not invest in expensive systems.
Yeah. I see a lot of advertisements, a lot of companies spending millions of dollars on fancy supply chain monitoring systems so that they can monitor everything down to the 5th tier on the dirt floor somewhere in China or India. And it doesn't work real well. And it would make a lot more sense for them to invest in manufacturing close by them so that it's a lot easier to monitor. The risks come down substantially. The number of nodes are reduced. So I'd say invest in local manufacturing rather than so much in supply chain monitoring systems that are forced on you by sourcing globally.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we have really only briefly touched the surface of like 5 topics, and I know that there were so many more things we could talk about. I do see a couple of questions in the chat that I'll read. This is from Lucas. The past few decades were dominated by globalization. Reshoring and FDI is an increasing trend according to the chart that you showed, Harry. The two concepts seem to be a bit opposed. Is this true? And how do you see the balancing act between the two? Because neither will be going away. So I guess, Harry, do you want to start with that one?
I guess. So globalization means to do business elsewhere. It doesn't necessarily mean to import everything you consume from elsewhere. So we think it's wonderful for GM to build cars in China to sell in China, and maybe for Chinese companies to build cars in the US to sell in the US. But the question is, where does the manufacturing take place? So we believe it's totally consistent for globalization in terms of manufacturing everywhere, but manufacturing local to the market, for that to take place, and at the same time for reshoring and FDI to take place coming back to the US. So I don't see a conflict between the two. I see consistency.
I'll just add that
Mhm.
we export up to 30% of our sales go for export. So we manufacture here, but we export outside the country, and we've sold to over 30 countries in our history. So you can do that. I agree with you. You don't have to move the factory there.
Right, I think that's a very good distinction, globalization. Again, I'm very much a globalist, but it doesn't mean you have to stop exporting and importing something. So, yeah, and Ken, what do you think about that? Any
Well, no,
thoughts?
I agree. And like I said, especially in the defense industry, you're seeing more and more international activity just simply to keep, sales increasing due to, flat budgets here in the US. Again, a lot of it is American made product that is being exported. So, even though we do have those offset situations and having to, create a supply base internationally, most of those, as Harry mentioned, are local to that particular customer. And so you get that advantage of having, parts of it here in the US that will never go global. I mean, never be able to be made globally, combined with things that are produced, locally within that country. It kind of satisfies the whole chain on the globalization.
Interesting. Well, we have a question also on one of the industries that I mentioned, I think up front, that's big here in Arizona, mining. So Colette asked, I'm in mining, and if we cannot produce rare earth materials or base materials domestically, what do you think the impacts will be, given that most come from China? So anybody have any?
Well, I can tell you, in a previous life, I actually worked for Intel, and one of the interesting things was there are a lot of rare materials that do come from China. And it was interesting, I actually worked in the supply chain organization there at Intel. We had contracts with places that were simply, I'll call it a mom and pop shop. They were, run out of somebody's garage. We were trying to connect electronically with our suppliers, and we had nothing. We would have to buy PCs for these places because they were so small. In order for us to do any kind of electronic transaction. And the unfortunate part about it is, they have the patents on some of the processing of these materials, and there's some situations where we're kind of stuck. So until we get to the point where we're able to get away from those kinds of things, I don't know how we get around that. I don't know if anybody else has any ideas.
Well, clearly the rare earth minerals are not that rare. In the United States, you could find almost all of the rare earth minerals. It's just a willingness to have a mine. It's dirty, it's messy, but you can mandate for it to be clean, and then to process. So right now, I think roughly China mines 50-60% of the rare earth, but they process 80-90%. So we're entirely dependent, and you need them for F-35s, and you need them for submarines, and you need them for chips, and you need them for all kinds of stuff. So we're entirely dependent on China for our highest technology, which is not rational. And so I hope the administration will put a higher emphasis on rare earths. It says it will, but they haven't actually gotten any new mines started or any new processing started that I know of. So I hope they'll raise the priority there.
All right, and of course, mining is one of those controversial industries, right, for a lot of people, especially here in Arizona. The other thing that maybe Harry and Kathy might not be aware of is that Tucson, not just Arizona, but Tucson, Arizona, is the mining tech capital, pretty much, of the world. So we have mining technology companies here where the Tech Council has actually held mixers. When we used to meet in person, we would have a mixer at one of their locations, and we could see through their cameras what they were doing in mines in other parts of the world. And so anyway, that's an aside that shows that we're doing pretty well on that. There's no other questions in the chat. A couple of comments. I would encourage anybody to save the chat. And there's somebody, I think, Brad, I don't know if this is somebody, Brad, if you're part of MIS, but you have written that you wrote about this a bit, and you put a couple of links to articles, and I would encourage anybody to look at that. We have a couple, just 2 minutes. Anybody on the panel have anything, closing remarks that you didn't have an opportunity to mention?
I've got a favorite sort of elevator comment. When you talk about technology, you think of automation. and some writers talk about taxing the robots because they're going to take away all of our jobs. And my conclusion is that that's a crazy idea, because we will lose more jobs to automation in China if we do not automate, because we won't be competitive, than we will to automation in the US if we do automate. Because we're competing in the world, we need to be as productive as we can. And because there's 40% of work that can come back just to balance the trade deficit, we can have higher productivity, more workers, and everything balance out and be wonderful. So I'm looking forward to a great future.
And I'd like to kind of tack onto that, because I just had this conversation in my operations class a couple of days ago about the fact that, automation, and, people look at automation as replacing jobs. What it really does is transforms jobs, because yes, it might take away some assembly jobs, but it also creates other jobs, because somebody has to run the machine, somebody has to maintain the machine, somebody has to program the machine. So there's really a whole separate set of jobs that get created by automation. And so it becomes, how do we train the workforce of the future to adapt to that?
Right, and we have, again, maybe on the call, maybe not, Brett and others who work in the robotics industry here in town. So we've seen some of that in action at our events, where robots can pour you a beer. So Harry and Kathy, if you can ever make it out here, you can see the beer pouring robot. So
Do they pour wine too?
I'm not sure. I'll have to see if Brett can arrange that. So I think we're ready to close out here. Carla, do you have any finishing comments?
No, actually, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for joining us today. Jan, thank you so much for moderating. And to our distinguished panel, Harry, Kathy, and Ken, thank you so much for sharing your time, your experience, and your subject matter expertise. It's so important that we have these types of conversations. I've learned a lot from you all today, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. To our attendees, thank you all so much for joining us and spending your morning with us. We have so many more events coming up. We invite you all to visit our website at aztechcouncil.org to connect with us and to find out all the future events that we have for the upcoming weeks and then the remainder of 2021. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great job.
Thanks.